Hello, everybody. Ooh, 5 o'clock on the dot. Yay. Welcome to this evening's book talk. Untapped New York is happy to have you. My name, if you don't know who I am, Justin Rivers. I'm the Chief Experience Officer with Untapped New York. Happy to have you with us at 5 p.m. in New York. Today's book talk is on Footnotes, the Black artist who rewrote the rules of the Great White Way. We are here with the book's author, Caseen Gaines, who's going to introduce himself in 1 second. I've put a link in the chat to purchase the book. I'll also be putting a link to purchase the book throughout the chat as we go along. As always, we are happy to have you here. If you have questions for Caseen during this presentation, please put them in the questions tab, which is right next to the chat, but please feel free to chat with me or others in the chat bar. I will be monitoring questions for Q&A afterward. Also, if you are joining us not as an insider, our insiders are here enjoying all of this virtual programming for as low as $10 a month for a virtual member, which includes unlimited access to our video archive where all of our talks and tours live, and unlimited access to all of these talks and tours as we offer them to you. If you're not an insider, you can join us by literally typing in the code "join us" in all caps for 1 month free. Please say hello. I'm going to say hello to a couple people, and then I'm going to be turning it over to Caseen. So hello, Robin, who is in the on the Upper East Side. Good to see you there, Robin. Hope all went well today. Pete from sunny San Francisco. It is also a gorgeous day here in New York, a little above 80. Nancy still in Arizona and missing New York for the boat tours. Yeah, we have a bunch of boat tours coming up. We even have another one coming up. And Brian from the wilds of East Ontario, Canada. Welcome, Brian. All right, so Caseen, I'm going to turn it over to you, and I will see all you guys at the end of the presentation. So take it away.
All right. Well, thank you so much for having me. And hi, my name is Caseen Gaines, and I am the author of Footnotes, the Black artist who rewrote the rules of the Great White Way. Footnotes is the phenomenal story of jazz musicians Noble Sissle and Eubie Blake and comedians Flournoy Miller and Aubrey Lyles, each only a generation removed from slavery, who formed a tenuous alliance that led to the first successful Broadway show with an all-Black cast and creative team. That show was 1921's Shuffle Along. And while you may not have heard of it before, you've likely heard of performers like Josephine Baker, Paul Robeson, and Nat King Cole, who each had this show as one of their earliest credits. Footnotes is largely set among the speakeasies, boarding houses, and emerging Black enclaves in Prohibition-era New York City, and begins with Sissle and Blake and Miller and Lyles begging, borrowing, and finessing their way through vaudeville, with their sights squarely set on Manhattan, a city that was still reeling with the economic effects of a world war and the aftermath of a global pandemic. Shuffle Along opened with its creators $21,000 shy of being flat broke. But by bringing the authentic sounds and dances of Harlem to the Broadway stage, they managed to both attract white audiences in search of something new and Black audiences who wanted to see themselves reflected in something other than minstrel shows. It was revolutionary, playing over 500 performances in Manhattan and touring the United States, including the Jim Crow South, while challenging taboos by daring to show Blacks as more than just caricatures. For the first time, the orchestra section of a Broadway house was integrated, and a revolutionary kind of music, jazz, was heard in legitimate theaters. In fact, one of the songs from the show, "I'm Just Wild About Harry," was later used for Harry Truman's successful presidential re-election campaign. The show's unprecedented success forever changed the look and sound of the entertainment industry. So to put it simply, Shuffle Along was Hamilton almost a full century earlier. And many people, including Langston Hughes, credit Sissle, Blake, Miller, and Lyles with single-handedly starting the Harlem Renaissance. Footnotes is about a moment in time, but its relevancy to our current moment is apparent on every page. While I had been researching this story for years, most of my writing was done while the world was on standstill due to the COVID-19 pandemic. The nation watched in horror as George Floyd took his last breaths, and people around the world took to the streets to ensure that Breonna Taylor's story was not only remembered, but that her name was said. And while the movement wasn't new, Black Lives Matter became an affirmation shared by people of all races and ethnicities around the world, and industries, including the professional theater community, reflected on the importance of racial inclusivity. And while we were collectively grappling with these dual pandemics, I was at my laptop, realizing that many of the same issues and conversations were taking place a century ago. The show was produced in the aftermath of what was known as the Red Summer, the greatest period of racialized violence in this country since the Civil War. Lynchings were regularly written about in newsprint, and in fact, the Tulsa Massacre was a week after Shuffle Along's debut on Broadway. And yet, in that landscape, these artists succeeded in a country designed to trap them in failure. Footnotes is a story that highlights the importance of representation and diverse creators living in their authentic truth and sharing the stories they want to tell. But it's also a stark reminder of the delicate dance Black folks have to do to achieve and hold on to success in a country built on our backs, but not built for us to flourish in. A truly American tale of how in 1921, the combined talent and determination of four men resulted in the most unlikely phenomenon of the 20th century, and how, despite their accomplishments, they were pushed to the sidelines, unable to overcome the systemic factors that relegated them to becoming little more than historical footnotes. Footnotes will be released this Friday. It's being sprung early for good behavior. It's coming out this Friday, May 18th, almost 100 years to the day that Sissle, Blake, Miller, and Lyles made history with their opening of Shuffle Along in Manhattan. I am so honored to share their stories with you. Their stories are the story of America. And so while I've been doing quite a bit of talking, I thought it would actually be good to help kick this off formally with Sissle and Blake speaking for themselves, actually, and performing a little bit to play us into the rest of this presentation. So what you're about to see actually is a bit of an experimental film that was shot in 1922. So this predates The Jazz Singer. This predates talking feature films. And this is actually the first time talking pictures were referred to as talkies on screen. And so Sissle and Blake will play a little bit for you.
Well, yeah, oh man, this ain't no movie. This is the talking. That's right. You ain't never gathered no more, girl. Get up there. I got a full mind on you. That you're something about you. Never a hope that you have learned. And I'm not even now, I'm proud of the house in Colorado. Whoever wants to track tell them what I said. Goodbye, and now I'm love. Carol Weather, Flournoy River. I'm mighty homesick and I wonder what the makes me why you might go for there, you might for that money over mine. Or your life just and if I just get back once again, I'll never wrong. From your money, I take the back from the bottom ship. Then it all together in the 20 hair. Take the moonlight from the time. Then I do the 20 with the phone ride. Take the time to walk the next week with the floor. Hanging on the hinges of the floor. Take all the money from the money. Then you have a picture of my heart. I was never on my feet. I was in this vein. But if I get back again, I'll never roam. From my money, from my money. Oh, oh, oh.
Did you like it? Well, if you liked it, just know that Sissle and Blake actually hated it. They hated this video when they saw it on film. And the reason why they hated it actually is because they were stage performers. They were used to performing on vaudeville. They ultimately performed on Broadway at the 63rd Street Theater. I know 63rd Street isn't really Broadway, but we'll talk about that in a bit. But when they saw this back on film, they actually hated it because they weren't able to move. And Noble Sissle, the vocalist, used to actually get up and sort of make his way around the stage, and he was very theatrical, and you can see by his hand gestures and by his facial expressions, they hadn't really calibrated for film. And so they learned a valuable lesson here that what works on the stage doesn't always work on screen. So while I enjoy seeing this, and hopefully you enjoyed seeing it, they were very particular about the way they came across on screen and didn't really love, think that this was the best representation of what it was like to see them on stage. So I love this picture just to sort of set the scene. And this is New York, 1921. And you can see amongst the cars and amongst the people, you can see this billboard above the St. Regis for Shuffle Along. Shuffle Along was really an unusual production when it debuted on May 23rd, 1921. And I don't know if there are any theater fans out there, any Broadway fans, but one of the things that's sort of interesting to think about is Broadway was actually about halfway dark when Shuffle Along opened in 1921. First of all, because of the heat, they actually used to close shows for the summer for the most part. So there were a lot of theaters that were already closed for the summer. And meanwhile, Shuffle Along was opening up, but also New York's economy was just devastated, not only by the World War and by really prohibition was a big thing that actually ended up affecting New York's economy. New York State, not just New York City, but New York State actually, before Prohibition, had generated 75% of its total revenue from the legal sale of alcohol. I know that sounds crazy, 75%, but New York State actually had generated 75% of its total revenue from the sale of alcohol. And so Prohibition really was an incredible detriment to the economy. And so Shuffle Along sort of grew out of this landscape where producers were able to sort of roll the dice on a show that probably otherwise would not have been staged in Manhattan. And so while Footnotes is sort of the story of Shuffle Along and how the show came to be, this is really what the book is about. It's about these four men. I think of it as kind of a group biography. And the four men that are really at the center of the narrative are Eubie Blake. And some of you may be familiar with Eubie Blake. He had a wonderful second act much later in his life. But this is Eubie Blake back in 1921. This is Noble Sissle, the lyricist of Shuffle Along. And he was also one of the actors in the show. And this is Flournoy Miller and Aubrey Lyles. And they were two comedians that wrote the book and also performed in the show. And so what you had in Shuffle Along was really these two duos that came together to form this amazing melange of a production. So I want to talk a little bit about each duo. I think that would be fair and equitable to do. So this is Miller and Lyles, and this is actually a promotional still from Shuffle Along. This is them on the set of Shuffle Along in 1921. Miller and Lyles were two highly educated men. They met at Fisk University, actually, in 1903, and they became fast friends. Neither one really was going to school to become a performer. That wasn't really a thing that you went to school for. But they had a natural knack for comedy, and they had a natural rapport with one another. And so one of the things that's really interesting about Miller and Lyles is They actually were one of the first acts that did not have any musical elements to their duo act. Some of you may be familiar with Williams and Walker, but Williams and Walker, especially Burt Williams, would sing a little bit during their comedy. But Miller and Lyles did not sing. They danced a little bit. That wasn't a part of really their, that wasn't in their wheelhouse per se. But I wanted to share with you a little piece of the book that talks a little bit about how they established their act in their early days of vaudeville and how they came to perform as a duo without any music. So this is from Footnotes. Even with the homely accommodations, Miller and Lyles were determined to set themselves up for success. They noticed that the African-American acts that did the best had singing and dancing, and while the men had a little rhythm, vocalizing was not in their wheelhouse. For added insurance, they hired 3 women as chorus girls and branded the act the Ebony Five. Booking agent Frank O'Doyle quickly found them work playing 15 shows a day at a small house on State Street, near the Loop in Chicago. The comedians barely had money left over for themselves after paying the chorus girls their salary, which became even more irritating when the women began showing up late to performances. As their first week approached its end, Miller and Lyles called a group meeting to address their lack of professionalism. The women laughed in their faces. Can you imagine the nerve of them? They can't sing or dance, and without us, they wouldn't have an act. We are carrying them. The comedians were furious. They had decided to grab a bite so they could blow off some steam and weigh their options when they ran into Frank Fabito, manager of the Ramshackle Theater. He complimented their comedic ability, and if they agreed to play another week, he was willing to increase their salary. Miller and Lyles confided that they were planning on taking some time away from the stage so they could replace their chorus, but they'd misunderstood. The manager liked the comedians. He thought the chorus girls were superfluous. Miller and Lyles ran back to the theater and laid it on thick, telling the women they didn't want to be a burden anymore and thanking them for carrying the show this past week. The chorus girls grabbed their things and left, and on their way out of the venue, they saw the sign being changed out front, Miller and Lyles held over another week. They turned on their heels, bursting with excitement over the news. Say, one of the women said, we're being held over for another week. Not you, Lyles said, dropping the facade. Miller and Lyles are being held over. But the women thought they'd have the last laugh. The next day, they returned to the theater, this time as spectators, certain they'd see the comedians fall on their faces. Miller and Lyles stepped onto the makeshift stage in burnt cork makeup, just as Hogan and Burt Williams had done before them. For the comedians, darkening their skin was a necessary means to an end. Blackface was the bait to draw them in, Miller explained. Once on the inside, they would enjoy our fine art. The two performed what they called a syncopated argument, a rhythmic exchange of one-upmanship and unfinished sentence bits, where they seemingly used telepathy to finish each other's statements. They ended with their old boxing routine from their days at Fisk, which once again brought the house down. Their former colleagues left without saying goodbye. And so Miller and Lyles were 2 comedians who actually performed in blackface, and they were Black comedians. And as I mentioned in this excerpt, you know, blackface for Black comedians at the time, right? Again, we're talking in this particular excerpt, we're talking about 1909. At the time, it was really a form of resistance, actually, for Black performers, in that white performers were making a buck at the expense of Black people, imitating them, trafficking in stereotypes. And for Black performers, they felt that it was a way to gain entry into what was previously all white spaces, to actually wear blackface themselves and darken their skin. And Flournoy Miller, the gentleman who's taller in this image, he actually was a lighter-skinned man, and he would show up to get work and make sure that his wrists were showing through his costume so that people might actually think that he was a white man going for a job in blackface so that he would be paid more. So it's sort of an interesting aspect of this. And by contrast, Sissle and Blake never performed in blackface. They always wore tuxedos. They really believed that to be the best representation of the race, they would have to sort of always be prim and proper, and that was the way they presented themselves. And so it's sort of an interesting thing when you look at Shuffle Along, because it was really kind of like Du Bois and Booker, like that conversation taking place on the stage at the same time. It was a musical review. It was fun. It was very progressive in a lot of ways. It was certainly progressive in terms of its plot. It was a political satire, but it also did traffic in some of the antebellum humor that would be comforting to white audiences. And in large part, that's why the show was so successful, because it was able to sort of straddle that line. So in addition to the four men who are at the center of the narrative, it was really exciting and fun for me to write about a number of the women of Shuffle Along. Shuffle Along was great in terms of parts for women. And in fact, Noble Sissle, who's seated here, actually said much later in his life that one of his greatest sort of accomplishments in this world was bringing Black women to the legitimate stage, not just in parts like Jezebels or Mammies, but just sort of as people that have the full range of emotions. This was something that was actually quite controversial in 1921. And the editor of Variety actually ran into Miller, Lyles, Sissle, and Blake as they were developing Shuffle Along and told them this show is going to be dead in the water because people will not pay Broadway prices to see Black women on stage. And Shuffle Along certainly proved him wrong, because people went to Shuffle Along in droves, and it was quite successful, playing over 500 performances in Manhattan. So the chorus girls or chorus women were very, very integral to the show. And I wanted to share the story actually of how one chorus girl in particular missed her opportunity to be cast in the show. So this is another excerpt from Footnotes. The next leg of their tour was highly anticipated, as Shuffle Along would be playing the Dunbar Theater in Philadelphia, where Sissle and Blake met Miller and Lyles just a few months ago. It was a site of new beginnings, and while in town, the group began to make formal preparations in advance of what they still hoped would be their Broadway run. They arranged to use the theater during the day to audition more chorus girls in the event that they had to shake things up before they played Manhattan. It was pouring outside the Dunbar the day of the tryouts, but there was still a long line of women wrapped around the corner. The most fortunate found refuge under the fire escape, but most just endured the elements on their small plot of sidewalk. Torn stockings and thin dresses hugged the women's bodies, and for those who were most fortunate, a thin coat too. While there were dozens waiting to walk through the theater's large glass doors, one was being slipped in through the side entrance. As she confidently strode toward the auditioning room, she couldn't help but think about the unlikely circumstances that led her there. What if she hadn't run into her old classmate from St. Louis, Wilsie Caldwell, in a bar the night before? What if Wilsie and her brother hadn't been part of the Shuffle Along company? She was a chorus girl, he was a dancer. And what if they hadn't been unable to stop talking about how the show and its creators were poised to take New York by storm? They're just full of ideas, Wilsie exclaimed. For example, all of the chorus girls will be mulattoes. The young woman decided to audition the next day. While she didn't know much about the show or the four men behind it, she was familiar with I'm Just Simply Full of Jazz, and that was good enough for her. She walked into the theater, still shivering from the cold, with wet hair, looking as if she had skipped more than a few meals. Eubie Blake was hunched over at the piano, his head buried in sheet music, barely taking notice of who walked in. while the show's other 3 writers looked her over. She did a dance routine, but before she had a chance to sing, Miller and Sissle had a quick sidebar. Then Sissle stopped the meeting in its tracks. "Too young," he said. She quickly turned on the charm. "But I'm 17, she lied. "Sorry," he continued. "Too small, too thin, too dark." She was embarrassed, hurt, angry, and sent on her way. Tears filled her eyes, and as she walked back towards the stage door entrance, half stumbling down the stairs that led to the street, the men inside could hear her faint sobs giving way to wails. When she met back up with her friend at the stage door, she vented her frustration at what just happened, saying the thin man with the mustache was ashamed of his kind. "It's just the opposite," Wilsey said. "He's hoping to beat the whites at their own game. Since they prefer blackface shows to real black performers, he's decided to give them white black folks. Shuffle Along isn't variety or burlesque. It's a real good comedy with a plot." Wilsey tried to convince her old classmate to ask for a job with the show as a dresser, assisting with costumes backstage, but the 15-year-old had done that already. She had been performing since she dropped out of school in the 5th grade, mostly on the streets and in night spots, both of which shamed her mother, and had been married twice. She was nearly 900 miles from her hometown, but a few days later, she decided to travel about 100 miles farther. She went to the train station, and with the last few dollars she had, Josephine Baker bought a one-way ticket to New York, determined not to let her skin color stop her from reaching the big time. And so Josephine Baker, at 15 years old, tried out for Shuffle Along and ultimately was rejected, but in a way that would become kind of classic for her. She ended up becoming a part of the cast anyway. She was very enterprising, even as a teenager, and managed to sort of find her way into one of the touring companies in a fun and exciting way, which I won't spoil for you. But she ultimately, from that touring company, attracted such attention that reviewers actually started to comment on the 6th chorus girl from the right. And it was Josephine Baker, and she was plucked out of the touring company and brought to the main company. So this is a photo of the full cast and crew, or casting company, I should say, of Shuffle Along. This is them playing the Selwyn Theater in Boston. And you can see, what I love about this photo is, if you can see, we have Miller and Lyles. This is Al Mayer, one of the producers, actually the manager of the show. This is Noble Sissle, Eubie Blake. And so you have a lot of the key players right there in the front row, or in that main row. And Josephine Baker, although she was very new to the cast, still managed to find her way right up front as well. This is Josephine Baker once she became part of the company. And so here she is as well, 6th chorus girl from the right, on the set of Shuffle Along. So another person that I wanted to mention is Florence Mills. And Florence Mills was not a member of the chorus, actually. She was one of the leads in Shuffle Along. And what I think is sort of interesting about Florence Mills is sort of the way that she found her way into the show and the way that she found her way out of the show is sort of representative, I think, of what happened to lots of performers whose orbit intersected with Shuffle Along. So Florence Mills was actually a replacement for an actress named Gertrude Saunders. And Gertrude Saunders originated her part, and she was a standout performer, and she ultimately was lured away from the cast to perform in a cabaret for, I think it was $5 extra a week. She was lured away by white producers. And so the creators of the show had to sort of scramble and figure out how they were going to replace Gertrude Saunders now that she had been taken away. And they found Florence Mills. Florence Mills was unlike Gertrude Saunders in every way. Gertrude Saunders had a strong soprano voice. Eubie Blake said, I'm paraphrasing him here, that she had a body that looked like someone had sculpted it. She was someone who just commanded attention visually and vocally. Florence Mills, by contrast, was very kind of bird-like, both in her voice and physically. And so very small, very kind of scrawny. Eubie Blake used to say that she could walk down the street and you wouldn't even notice her, even though she was an amazing celebrity and star after she was in Shuffle Along. So ultimately, she was lured away as well from the show and offered an opportunity to perform in a revue called Plantation Revue above the Winter Garden Theater. There was a cabaret, and she performed at this cabaret in a show that was custom made for her, which was sort of a very stereotypical Southern antebellum musical revue. And she left Shuffle Along to go do that. Not to be outdone, though, the creators of Shuffle Along actually staged their own rival revue at Reisenweber's Cafe, which was located in Columbus Circle. It was at 58th Street and 8th Avenue. And so you sort of had, for the entire duration of Shuffle Along's run, this sort of gamesmanship where white producers would sort of lure the actors away and they would stage sort of rival productions. Certainly there were Black artists that staged rival productions as well. And then you had the four men behind Shuffle Along sort of reinserting their position and competing with their competitors, not only with Shuffle Along, but with other productions as well. So that continued for a long period of time. And so what I really love about telling this story is it's not just a story of 1921. It's a story that begins in the late 1800s, I think in 1881, and it really goes up until 1952, when the second revival of Shuffle Along was staged. And it's a mild spoiler, but the second revival of Shuffle Along was a disaster. And as much as I love writing about successes, I also love writing about disasters. And so it was a disaster of a show. It was ill-fated for lots of reasons. And I won't tell you how many productions it lasted, but it did not have it did not have anywhere near the success that the 1921 production had. But after that 1952 production, really all of the creators of Shuffle Along more or less went into retirement. I'm gonna have a quick sip of my lemonade for a moment. More or less went into retirement. However, as some of you may know, Eubie Blake had an amazing second act in life. He was on Saturday Night Live. He was on Johnny Carson. He was kind of everywhere. And of course, there was a Broadway revue, Eubie, which starred Gregory Hines. And Eubie Blake was actually nominated for a Tony Award for that production. And so it was amazing that he not only had an opportunity to sort of get some of the accolades that he deserved, but also to see this great renaissance of Black theater in the 1970s and 1980s as well. The Wiz, Dreamgirls, Bubbling Brown Sugar, just to name a few. There were just amazing productions in the 1970s, and Eubie Blake was there to see all of that and kind of be this living legend. But the last excerpt of the book that I wanted to share with you is actually from the last time Eubie Blake and Noble Sissle performed together. So this was 1973, and I'm not going to set this up too much. I'm just going to throw you right into this excerpt. This will be the last excerpt that I share with you. The following January, Eubie Blake and his wife Marion traveled to Tampa, Florida to see Sissle, who was experiencing concerning bouts of extreme memory loss. It would be the last time the two men would see each other. That was terrible, Blake said afterward. I never should have gone. Poor Sissle. He kept asking me if I had any trouble finding the subway. There's no subway in Tampa. He don't even know he ain't in New York. I felt so bad seeing him like that. However, the trip was more than a social visit. The singer's son, Noble Sissle Jr., worked in television and wanted to sit down with both Eubie Blake and his father in front of an audience for a short biographical video, knowing there would be few opportunities left to capture the two men together on film. He said Sissle would be all right, but I didn't believe it, Blake recalled. As the cameras rolled, the pianist sat in a black swivel chair at a small organ, prepared to play while expecting the worst. His partner sat to his right in an identical chair. The two senior citizens sat across from Noble Jr., who looked every bit as modern as they looked of the past, decked out in a sand-colored suit with a mile-high afro, appearing about 7 feet tall, sitting in a chair with mustard cushions. Blake began playing Gee, I'm Glad That I'm From Dixie, which was always their first number in their old vaudeville act, but his partner never came in. Leaning back with his left leg crossed over his right, with an index finger never leaving his cheek. The pianist continued carrying the conversation and performance until his long fingers tickled the introductory notes to I'm Just Wild About Harry. And to his surprise, Noble Sissle perked up. He uncrossed his legs, leaned forward, and with a voice just as strong and smooth as it ever was, began singing right on time. Blake winced in surprise and began playing softer, not fully believing what he had just heard, but his partner kept the tempo and rhythm going, forcing the pianist to match his energy. With a smile and a head nod to Noble Jr., Blake liberated his fingers to do what they did best, and Noble Sissle called his digits to attention as well, punctuating his singing with expressive hand movements. The camera person zoomed in on the vocalist, and when the two reached the chorus, the audience applauded, causing the singer's eyes to twinkle and his mouth to curl upward into a smile. Even if it was just for a day, for one final song, Sissle and Blake were back. Right after we got done, he started talking nonsense, the pianist said regretfully. I couldn't stand that. Noble Sissle died a year later, on December 17th, 1975, at 86 years old. And so I had actually spoken with Noble Jr. Quite a bit for this book, and he told me about this moment during our first conversation, and it struck me as being very powerful. And what actually was amazing to me was Noble Sissle Jr. was able to actually share some of this video with me. And so, because I loved seeing it, the last thing I'd like to do before we open it up to questions is I wanted to share this, just a little piece of this final performance of Sissle and Blake with you.
I'm just wild about Harry. There's just one fellow for me in this world. Harry's his name, that's what I claim. For every fellow there must be a girl, and I found my mate by the gift of fate. I'm so wild about Harry, Harry's wild about me. The heavenly glimpses of fill me with ecstasy. He's sweet like chocolate candy.
Just a little piece, but that is the final performance of Sissle and Blake, who were partners in their careers for really north of 6 decades, and just had an amazing run together, which I'm excited to share with you in Footnotes, which I know it says that it's out May 25th, but it's been moved up just slightly to this Friday. So if you pre-order it, I think that all pre-orders, the link that's going through will go to the Lit Bar, which I believe is in the Bronx, that you'll get it. Hopefully you'll get it by the weekend. You can start jumping in. But thank you so much for listening to a little bit about Footnotes. And if there are questions, I'm excited to take them.
Caseen, that was amazing. First of all, I have to say you have nothing absolutely to worry about, because this was an amazing presentation, beautifully done, beautifully balanced.
Oh, thank you.
I know what we were talking about before. Lorraine already said she loved it. So um awesome. And the writing so beautiful, so clear. Like I actually wanted you to read more. So, I know you were like, I don't know, how should we balance the reading? I was like, nah, I think it's good. And it was great. It was all just beautifully presented. Yeah, Cynthia said the same thing. Joe said the same thing. Thanks for showing that last excerpt. So do we have any questions for Caseen? You were so thorough too. I'm going to kick it off with a question while some of our insiders are coming up with theirs. So what was the process for you in researching this? This seems like it was quite a Herculean task. So how did you go about it? And you said you had spoken to one of the key players. Now, how did you get in contact? How did that all work?
Sure. So, so I've written, this is the 5th book that I've written, and it's actually interesting to me because this is the first book that I've written where all of my key players have passed on. You know,
right.
I'm writing about 1921.
Right.
And so, luckily, you know, and this is sort of one of the interesting things about this project is they were incredibly successful and well documented throughout the 1920s and really 1930s. So the Black press was so incredibly present at that time that there were publications like the Baltimore Afro-American. There actually was a Negro syndicated newspaper organization that would write articles and just distribute them to Negro publications throughout the country. And so I was able to just dig into archives and just have an absolute ball. In addition, some of the main characters in my book have unpublished memoirs. So I was able to gain access to some of those, which was amazing. And just to get a little bit of flavor and context and color. And some of those have just been very recently discovered. So those stories really haven't been told anywhere besides in Footnotes. And then they also had archives at the New York Public Library, the Schomburg Center. There are archives down in Baltimore. There's some in Atlanta. And so, yeah, there's just a lot that I was able to dig into. Believe it or not, actually, I had so much information that the harder part was actually figuring out what to leave out. And in a way, it kind of made it easier for me to focus just on the story that I wanted to tell, which was really a story on representation, on systemic racism. You know, I touched on it a little bit in my intro, but it's a book about men that created a Broadway show, but it is so much more about New York in the 1920s.
Yeah.
For people of color. And so being able to not only research about these men and the show, but also just about the period was amazing for me. And it was just, I loved it. I always love the research part of writing.
Yeah, me too. That's why I asked, because that's my favorite part. And somebody,
it's hard to know when to turn off the spigot. You know, you just want to keep going, and at some point you get an email from an editor saying, you know, how's the writing going, and it makes you it makes you stop.
Like, oh wait, writing? Wait.
Yeah, exactly.
What I was doing?
Right.
I know the feeling too well. And Mary had said this was so wonderful. I love that you put in the New York context of the 20s, which you mentioned. So it's such a really rich, vivid time for New York. So this is a really great lens to put over it, I think. We had a question come in from Brian. And Lorraine. I'll start with Lorraine first and work backwards. How many performers or artists are mentioned in the book?
Oh boy. So many, actually. And it was actually I mean, if I had to put a number on it, I would probably say somewhere in the vicinity of 40, 50 or so. And I really tried to make sure that I gave everyone their due, because what was amazing to me, the more that I read, the more that I researched, was how many Black artists there were that were just trying to make it. And I don't mean make it in terms of necessarily, you know, becoming household names, but I mean like make it in order to eat, make it in order to have just like a nice, you know, nice home, a nice apartment. And I really felt very strongly that you could write a book about like almost any of the Black artists that I've written about in here. And I wanted to sort of honor that because I'll talk a little bit about the title, Footnotes, and it kept coming to me as I was writing that I kept trying to reconcile how famous these performers were, and yet how unknown they were to so many people. I'm a Broadway fan, and most of the people, not all, but most of the people that I was writing about, I had never heard of. And they were huge stars of the day. And so I started thinking about how we sort of believe that people who are very prominent and very successful today will always be remembered by history. That, you know, that 100 years from now, they will remember, I'll use Oprah as an example, that 100 years from now, they will remember Oprah, or they will remember Beyonce, or they will remember Madonna. And the reality is they won't. And they won't because there were people 100 years ago that were just as famous in their time and left an indelible mark on society. And they have sort of been forgotten. But if you are lucky, what you have done lasts. And even if your name is sort of just printed in a book as a footnote, that's still an amazing mark to leave on history, isn't it? And so I sort of wanted to sort of reclaim, you know, footnotes as not being these things that are relegated to the sidelines. But certainly when I read, sometimes I get lost in the footnotes, and I feel like the footnotes are the more interesting part of the book. And so I wanted to sort of make the case that I think the footnotes of history might actually be the more interesting part of history.
That's really, that was great. I was wondering, and I was thinking the same thing. I was like, I wonder why I called it Footnotes. And I thought maybe it had something to do with dancing. But that's an amazing, I agree. The footnotes are where all the good stuff is. Awesome. Yeah. Awesome. We had a question come in from Brian. He said that first footage of the younger Sissle Blake, did you know if any other performers were recruited? And of course, any surviving footage, ? The whole fact that footage exists seems to be worth investigating.
Yeah, great question. I do. And in fact, I'm doing a quick look in the book. Did I say that? I want to say Eddie Cantor was also one of the people who was recruited. I could find it is in the book. There is a list, and I'm sure I could find it. But I believe Eddie Cantor was, I would think, like Al Jolson was certainly of the period. Al Jolson was not one of the people that was recruited, but I think there were 6 different vaudevillians that were all recruited, and they all recorded their bits separately in a Broadway house. And that was it. They all performed these really brief bits for DeForest. I'm blanking on his first name. It starts with an L, I think. But his last name is DeForest. And they were these experimental short films, and ultimately they were the precursor to, you know, full-blown talking pictures. I don't know if there's other surviving footage, to be honest with you, from the other performers. But Sissle and Blake did record Lee DeForest. Thank you. And it was with an L. It was right there on the tip of my tongue. Thank you, Lee DeForest. So there were other performers that that were recruited, certainly, and it would be interesting to see if that other footage survives. I have to imagine that it probably does. If the Sissle and Blake footage does, their footage probably does as well.
Cool. Robin said, "Great talk. My friend wrote the book Black Broadway a few years ago."
I love that book. I know. In fact, I won't. You'll have to take my word for it, but on this bookcase, it's there. I can pull it out and show it to you right now.
There you go.
That's awesome. Please give him my congratulations on it. I think it's an amazing book. Good book.
Pete Tannen says, "Thank you for a great presentation. I enjoyed the clips that you showed." And Michael Caine was the one who clarified Lee DeForest. So
Thank
do
you.
we have any other questions for Caseen? Caseen, this is, again, a wonderful presentation. Brian says thanks, and of course, the Soundies series are crazy cool.
Absolutely.
So, like I had said before, I think that you have a very fruitful and long promotion for this book that is going to be great if you bring to it what you brought to us this evening. We really appreciate it. All of the care. The presentation was great. And again, I'm going to put the link one more time in the chat if you are interested in purchasing the book from, and I love that you chose the Lit Bar as the place to get the book. Please do. And oh wait, I think another question might have come in.
No worries. I'm here. I'm here for all of you.
Thanks. Lots of old shows got made into movies. Has Shuffle Along ever appeared in another form? Oh, good question, Joe. That's from Joe from London.
Oh, let me tell you. So that's a great question. There were several attempts actually to bring Shuffle Along to the big screen, actually, in the late 1940s and early 1950s. And there were projects that were set up, I believe, at Fox and with some smaller studios, and they just never materialized. But you know, I will tell you, I think the story of these men would be just an amazing thing to see on screen. And I hope, I don't know if anyone's seen Ma Rainey's Black Bottom, you know, that was on Netflix, George C. Wolfe's Rainey's Black Bottom, but it was, I thought it was brilliant. And I have to say, just truthfully, watching that film, there were moments where I was seeing what I had written in Footnotes. You know, there's something very cinematic about the story to me, not only about the time period and the men and the dynamic between all of them, but also something about the something about just New York 1920s. It was just an electric time, and they're sort of out of nowhere rise and then kind of fall of these performers. Look, Footnotes the movie is something I'd watch too. You know, what do we do? Kickstarter? No, listen, you know, look, I fingers crossed. I think it would be fantastic, and I think it would be also very timely. So we'll see if we can make that happen. I'd love to see it on screen.
Hey, there you go. All right. Any other questions before we wrap it up? I see. Oh, thanks, Joe. All right. Well, again, Caseen, thank you so much for this and bringing this to Untapped. I hope that everybody here tonight goes out and purchases a copy of the book and gets cracking, gets into it. And I will let you know that for those of you here tomorrow, for the rest of the week on our Insiders docket, at noon tomorrow, I will be presenting the Lost New York series, our next part in the series, which is about the mansions of Fifth Avenue, which is certainly a very, very thick and heavy topic. So we're going to take it. We'll have fun with it tomorrow. That's at noon. And then Thursday, we're having another book talk about the Waldorf Astoria, a new book that is coming out, and that will be at 5 p.m. on Thursday. So we hope to see you there. Caseen, any final thoughts before we end tonight?
Listen, I just want to thank everyone, and it is such an honor to be able to share the stories of these performers. I love to hear feedback from people. I'm on social media. You can follow me at Caseen Gaines, CASEEN GAINES. You can do it right now. I won't be offended if you take out your phone and start typing away. But seriously, you know, I hope you enjoy the book. I hope you enjoy everything, and continue to uplift and celebrate stories by Black authors, you know, telling Black stories. I'm just so honored to be able to have this opportunity to do it, and I hope that that in publishing there are more opportunities for more people to do this as well. So thank you.
Yeah, awesome. And so is that your Instagram handle or Twitter?
Yes, I'm on Instagram, I'm on Twitter, and I'm on Facebook as well.
Okay. So as everybody or most people who come to these events know, that this chat remains live when you get the playback. And the playback will be coming at you in a couple of minutes after we wrap up. So you can, if you miss it when I end the event, it'll still be there for you to get Caseen's social media handles, and of course the link to buy the book as well. So awesome. Have a really great night. Good luck with the book, Caseen, and we hope to see you. Hey, if there's another book in the future or Footnotes the movie, let us know.
Let's do it. I'll be back. Thanks so much.
Yeah,
Just been
you.
Great. Untapped. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Caseen. And everybody, thank you for joining us. Hope to see you again soon. Have a good night, everybody. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Ooh.